Hi, I'm Angie, and I work primarily on improving college physics education as well as supporting first-time STEM instructors. To paint you a picture of the types of things we'll do in this module, there's three main pieces. The first is that we'll hear from STEM education experts as well as STEM graduate and undergraduate students about some of their experiences. And second, we'll get to case study some particular assessments and feedback mechanisms. And lastly, we'll also engage you in some hands-on activities that will support your thinking. So what we'll ask you to do is take a minute to look at the journaling prompt on the slide in front of you, and then take a few minutes to journal on this activity. And so as you listen to these graduate student stories, pay attention to what strikes you, whether there are any differences between your journal and their story, particularly with respect to feedback.
And outside of STEM, I think at the end of the month here, I'm going to test for my blue belt in Kung Fu, and I'm really excited about that. One of the things that's come up recently is, if you kick improperly, you can start straining some of the smaller muscles in your legs. And I don't know if I was kicking improperly or something, but my hip started having some, amount of pain in it. And I found out that there were certain ways that I could do the movements that were actually better in general that didn't cause my hip to be in pain. So having some, maybe sort of negative feedback was helpful in getting me to learn how I have to move in order to, overcome that. He's a fantastic teacher in the fact that he recognizes, what people should be able to do at different ranks. And so you start out and he gives a lot of positive feedback on, oh yeah, you're doing a good job, you're putting good effort into it. If he picks one thing that he wants to focus on kicks for the day, then, as long as you're adhering to focusing on that one thing with him, then, you're going to get good feedback, and then eventually once you've practiced all of those things, and you realize is after you've been there for a couple of years, then you start to build up the ability to look at multiple things at the same time. And sort of, he has a really good idea of what expectations should be set at for each person. So not, when you start out and you have a white belt, you're not expected to do anything perfectly.
I came up with my own PhD project and wrote up my first proposal that I submitted to NASA for funding, and it didn't get funded, but that's okay because hardly anybody does, especially now. But I was really happy because I got feedback from my advisor, and he said, I really like this idea. I've actually been interested in this. This sounds really cool. And the reviewers for the actual proposal, I got feedback on that, and it was actually really positive. There was nothing in there that said, this is the dumbest idea we've ever heard. Why would you ever get funded for this? And they really just said, this is a strong application, but it's a little thin here and here. And so now I have good motivation to go and revise it for next year, and hopefully next year will be better. So.
And what kind of feedback helped you get to where you were at before you got the feedback from the from that committee? Like, how did you...
In writing the proposal?
Yeah, exactly. Like, how did you get to a place where you could write a proposal that was so well received?
I got a lot of good feedback from some of my peers, actually. So other PhD students who have gotten successfully funded through this same group, and I gave them my proposal to look at, and they had a lot of really constructive feedback on places where things were a little weak, or formatting ideas, even stuff like that. So it was just very helpful to kind of kick around ideas with my peers as well.
So now that you've heard some of these graduate student stories, take a minute to reflect and compare them to your own journal. And remember to focus on the role of feedback along the way. So I want to use the NASA grant story as a grounding example to talk a little bit about what's important to the process of learning and improving. So let's go to the whiteboard. So we just had a graduate student share a little about her experience writing a NASA grant, and I'd like to use her story to talk a little bit more generally about the process of learning and improving. And one thing that she mentioned that was really central and important to her process was feedback. That was one of the major pieces that helped her learn and improve her grant. And before feedback is even possible, there's a step that has to happen before that, and that's actually measurement. This is a little obvious maybe, but the very first thing that has to happen is that something is created, you write a grant or some action is performed, you maybe give a talk, and this object or action is the thing that's going to be measured and given feedback on. And then after you go through this process and you get some feedback, the next important step is that you take the feedback to formulate a plan, and then after formulating that plan, you get to revise that plan into some concrete improvement to your object or action. And so this is the learning cycle as a whole. And just to point out a couple important pieces to it. So as instructors, we have a lot of control over the types of objects or actions that we're asking students to perform. And we might ask them to work on a homework set with textbook problems. We might ask them to do an interpretive dance. And then it's really important that we get clear on the types of measurements, goals, and rubrics that we have for students so that everyone's on the same page. So you can imagine in the NASA grant case, if you're writing a NASA grant and it wasn't possible to know what you're going to be evaluated on, that would be really frustrating. And so getting really clear here is really important to both students and ourselves. And then after a measurement's taken, it's not an easy one-step process to get to feedback. There can be a little bit of some skills to develop to figure out how to communicate measurement into a way that students can use. So one other really important thing to point out in this diagram is that it's possible to go through a learning and feedback process alone, but there's often a lot of things that you can't really see, and it's helpful to have peers and mentors and mentees who can take a look at our performances and the things that we create to help us in understanding ways to improve it. And so there's really this large community of people that are ideally involved in the learning and improvement process, and they can be involved all along every step of the way.